Thanks. Just check your posture, make sure you're nice and comfy and relaxed. Ideally, your back should be nice and straight, but without forcing anything. Just do a few rounds of meditatively on your breathing. Again, it's to help to calm down the mind, get our attention more fully into the present moment. So in a nice relaxed way, just turn your attention onto the natural rhythms of your breathing. Don't force it, just watch your breathing naturally. Notice those subtle sensations as you breathe in and out. The air enters at that point of the nostrils. Again, notice the sensations there. Goes down into your body as your diaphragm moves down. And again, notice as your diaphragm pushes back up. Again, notice the air leaving your body at that point of the nostrils. Now we're going to hone our attention to that point of the nostrils. Notice the subtle sensations at that point as you breathe in. And just try and hold your attention at that point. Don't try and force it. If you become distracted, it's not a problem. Just as soon as you notice, it's a nice, relaxed way. Just place your attention back at that point of the nostril. Don't follow those thoughts or distractions. Let them fall away. Wait until that. Just do that quietly to yourself for a couple of minutes. Okay, I'm now going to slowly recite the Refuge and Bodhicitta prayer. You can join in if you like. And then we'll do a little reflection on how to recite. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened. The Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create, through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened. To the Buddha, the Dharma, the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create, through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened. To the Buddha, the Dharma, the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Let's just reflect on those words I've just recited, and particularly the last two lines, which are really about our motivation. It's very important we try and have as positive a motivation as we can for any activity. The best kind of motivation we can have is bodhicitta. The altruistic intention based on great compassion for all sentient beings aspires to achieve enlightenment so we can be the most benefit to really, really help everyone. Particularly reflect that we're not here just to benefit ourselves, although that's a part of everyone. But also to be able to put us in a better position to be able to truly benefit ourselves. We're now going to do the Tonglen practice, taking and giving practice, which we've looked at before. We're going to do a proper session of this. And the first thing I want to say is if at any point during this you're feeling uncomfortable, you feel you need to stretch, just do it. It's not about just really sitting still for a period of time. The main thing is that we're comfortable. So if you do need to stretch, just do that gently and mindfully without it interfering with meditation as much as you can. Firstly, we're going to apply this practice to ourselves. It's a really good way of grounding the practice, as I've explained before. We very naturally want to help overcome our own problems or difficulties. So want ourselves to be happy. But also, it's very, very important that we're kind towards ourselves. Remember those words of Lama Yeshe's, be gentle with yourself and you'll be gentle with others. So first of all, you can either just think of yourself sitting where you are right now, or if it's helpful, you can imagine that you sat in front just a few places. So whichever one of those seems most natural. Bring to mind some of the problems and difficulties that you experience. Worries about health, aging, mortality. Problems at work, problems with money, problems with friends or family. Try and think of some specific things that cause you stress and worry. Really try and connect this with your heart, that real sincere feeling that you feel that you'd like to be able to overcome all these problems. Try not to blame yourself for your shortcomings. Things are just a result of mental afflictions, which we all possess. Share that. We can change. So as you breathe in, you imagine that you're taking those problems and difficulties away from yourself. Form of thick smoke. That enters a dark space at your heart, and that represents a self-centered mind, particularly self-cherishing and also self-grasping ignorance. Utterly uprooting that, and that then transforms into beautiful, blissful light. And again, as you breathe out, imagine that light totally filling your body and your mind, purifying you of all problems, limitations, giving you happiness, and every positive quality, love, compassion, skillful means, wisdom, and so on. Just do that for a few rounds in relation to yourself. Really try and connect with your heart again with this and really think, may I have happiness in this cause? Okay, now bring to mind a person that you naturally feel close to, feel affectionate towards. And try and think of an actual person. It makes this much more effective. So it could be a friend, partner, mother, father, that you naturally feel very close to. Again, trying to connect with your actual feelings towards the person. Affection you naturally feel. I really would like this person to be happy, to overcome their problems and imagine that person sat in front of you, facing you. bring to mind some of their specific problems that you're probably aware of if you know this person. And if you won't be aware of all their problems, but they'll have worries about health, about money, about family, friends, and so on. Now, again, as you breathe in, you imagine you're taking these problems and difficulties away from them. Forming thick smoke again. Again, that enters that dark space of the heart, which represents the self-centered attitude. Turning that around and uprooting it as that transforms into beautiful, blissful light again as you breathe out. That light pours out from your heart, entering this person's body and mind, totally filling them, viewing them with happiness, and every positive quality, all the causes of wisdom, compassion. Do that for a few rounds. Really try and feel it. Again, you think, may this person of happiness and its causes. Feel that from your heart. We're now going to move our attention to think of a person that we don't find get on with very easily. Again, really try and think of an actual person. It could be a challenging person at work. It could be somebody within your family, your neighbour, or somebody just in your neighbourhood. Try and think of an actual person. Imagine that again, they're sat there in front of you, next to this friend that you've just been facing you. Now, again, if you know this person quite well, you might be aware of some specific problems they're experiencing. Bring those to mind. Even if you're not aware of specific problems, you can be sure that they'll experience a lot of the same worries and fears and insecurities. Yeah. It's about health, friends, lack of friends, big one. Just be very depressed. I mean, quite often, if people have a lot of negative energy, that's often a sign of health. Just like you and this friend that you've just been thinking about, and in fact, everybody else. Be be sure that they're trying to achieve happiness, trying to avoid suffering. They're not necessarily doing the right things to achieve that, again, due to ignorance and the other mental afflictions. Actually similar to yourself if you really check. And even if it might be difficult, think how better it would be for everybody, for the world in general, if this person really was happier, content, peaceful. So again, as you breathe in, imagine you're taking all this person's problems and difficulties away, again in the form of thick smoke. Entering that heart, dark space of the heart. Self-centered attitude, turning that around, utterly uprooting that. Again, that transforms into beautiful, blissful light. As you breathe out, that pours out from your heart. Again, totally filling this person's body and mind, giving them happiness. And the causes of happiness, again, wisdom, love, compassion, so on. So again, do that in relation to this person that you find challenging just for a few rounds. And again, really try and think and feel it from your heart. And this can be challenging. Sometimes if you're finding this too much, it's better just to go back to friends, yourself with this practice. Then you can return back and just keep working. Just don't expect too much of yourself. Really try and think, may this person have happiness in its core. Now we're going to imagine that joining these two people that you've been thinking about so far in front of you, the whole retinue of beings, and you can build this up gradually. You've only got so much time to go through this fairly quick. But you can think of other people you know quite well. Not just in front, think of beings to your right, the left and behind you. Not just humans, you can think of animals as well. And again, as long as these beings are unenlightened, they're still going to have the same basic problems. They're trying to achieve happiness, avoid suffering. They're not always doing the right things to achieve that due to affliction. Feel that sense of connection with all these beings. And again, as you breathe in, you imagine you're taking these problems and difficulties away from them. Big smoke, which again enters that dark space at your heart. Self-cherishing attitude, turning that around, uprooting it. Again, as you breathe out, beautiful, blissful light goes out in all directions from your heart. Again, totally filling all these beings' bodies and mind, them happiness, causes of happiness, every positive quality. Again, wisdom, compassion, and so on. As you breathe in and out, again, keeping going with that, you can imagine stretching that out as far as you can possibly imagine. You can go out into the far reaches of space. Again, as long as they're unenlightened beings, they're still likely to be having the same kinds of problems. Go into other realms of reality if that resonates with you. You're trying to feel that sense of connection. And think, may all these beings have happiness in its causes. Try and really feel that from your heart. Finally, let's dedicate any benefit that's come through doing this practice. And let's try and bring this attitude into our lives generally. It's a really important part. Think how that can contribute, even to the smallest extent, all the subtle workings of cause and effect, towards the long-term benefit of all being. Okay. Are you okay there, Susie?
Yes, I am.
Oh, good. I just noticed your camera's off. You can still hear us clearly, can you?
Yes, I can. It's all right. I'm just charging up my iPad. It needs charging, so I've been having it on charge while actually meditated.
Okay. That again is the Tom Len practice, which obviously we've done a few times now. I've deliberately started with that tonight because we're going to be looking at verses 7 and 8 now, the last two of the 8 verses. And verse 7 is particularly about that practice. So I'll just read it out. In short, I will offer directly and indirectly every benefit and happiness to all beings, my mothers. I will practice in secret, taking upon myself all their harmful actions and suffering. So that's verse 7, which is basically a summary of that practice we've just done. There's just a couple of things I'm not going to talk too much about that because I want to talk a little bit about verse 8. Obviously, we've just done the meditation. But obviously, this isn't just a meditation. It's a kind of attitude that we're trying to bring into our lives generally. Obviously, you're not going to sit down and do the visualization if you've got a difficult person kind of giving you grief in front of you at that time. But if you do that practice regularly, you can kind of bring that attitude to bear in those situations. Adita talked at the start, I remember last week, you've been doing it on your moped, haven't you? Coping with the stress of the traffic in Bristol, which I think is wonderful. But it is actually very, very practical, that. And a short way of kind of doing that, and a nice little mantra we can have in our head, is just may this person have happiness. That's quite a simple way, and particularly if you're encountering a difficult person. Again, it's a good application of mindfulness, that, when it kicks in, because it can suddenly help to turn the situation around. I mean, I find that very effective sometimes. And particularly if you're faced with somebody that you find quite challenging and difficult, just reminding yourself of that. The only other thing I'm going to say about that verse, it does say in line 3, I will practice in secret, taking upon myself their harmful actions and sufferings. Well, in fact, that's often interpreted two ways, that in secret bit. One explanation is because traditionally this was actually considered quite an advanced practice. It wasn't always taught to everyone. And the reason I mention it, it is quite challenging, this practice, particularly when we get very deeply into it. It's quite easier to surface level to sit there with a nice smile and thinking, may all sentient beings have happiness. When we really start engaging with our feelings, it can get worse. And it's sometimes something I've certainly experienced on retreat. And it is good to bear that in mind. And as always, I know I do bang on about this a lot, but as always, this thing of being gentle with yourself is really, really important, and not expecting too much of yourself. We can't just click our fingers and immediately feel spontaneous love and compassion towards everybody, you know, regardless of the way they're treating us. We're not Buddhas yet at the end of the day. So it is important that we bear that in mind. And some people, if they find it very, very challenging with a person that they find very difficult, occasionally you need to rein back a little bit, you know, and perhaps return to doing it in relation to yourself and to people you feel more kindly about, or to people you feel more neutrally about. And then again, you can re-engage and keep working on it like that. But that's the reason I wanted to mention that. The other interpretation of that, though, is that, and this is true really with all our practices, is we're not doing it to be for show, to be seen by others. When it says in secret, this is mainly it's changing our own attitude, and of course that will in turn affect everything we say. But it's quite important that we're not doing it just to sort of make a show, which takes us very nicely into what I'm now going to say about verse 8, because that talks about the 8 worldly dharmas, and a big part of this is trying to make our motivation as pure as possible whenever we're doing anything. Which on the one level, it makes it more effective in terms of helping the other, but it also makes us more resilient, so we're not going to get put off when things don't necessarily go the way we want, and we don't get the immediate short-term kind of gains that we might be looking for, which is quite important. So I'll read verse 8 now, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about this. It's through perceiving all phenomena as illusory, I will keep these practices undefiled by the stains of the 8 worldly concerns. And free from clinging, I will release all beings from the bondage of the disturbing, unsubdued mind and karma. Now, this verse is really bringing the wisdom side of the path to bear, which was something I explained back in week 1, how the path is often divided into those 2 halves, method and wisdom. The method side includes all sorts of things, but the most important side of that is compassion and bodhicitta, which is based on great compassion, which is the main antidote to self-cherishing, which I've explained, haven't I, before. The wisdom side is the teachings on emptiness and selflessness. And this is really bringing that to bear when it talks about perceiving all phenomena as illusory. But before I get to that, I think I better explain what the 8 worldly concerns are. You'll sometimes hear these described as the 8 worldly dharmas. Sorry, the cat sat on me. You'll sometimes hear these called the 8 worldly dharmas. What they are in brief is attachment to pleasure, praise, gain, and fame. That's the first 4. The other 4, which are kind of their opposites, is aversion to pain, to criticism, to loss, or to notoriety. And as it says in this verse, we try, whenever we're doing any kind of action or practice, not to let these things contaminate it. But I think it needs a little bit of explanation now. When we talk about attachment and aversion, we're talking about self-centered attachment and aversion here, which, as I explained, I think going back to week 1, together with fundamental ignorance, that's self-grasping ignorance, which again we're going to get to in a minute. These are the things that really are at the root of all our problems and difficulties. From a Buddhist point of view, these are the things that keep us bound to samsara, or psychic existence. That's the way we put it in. When we talk about, though, for instance, attachment to pleasure and avoiding that, this doesn't mean that we can't appreciate and enjoy things. And this is really, really important. We should take joy in things. I mean, if you think of, say, somebody like His Holiness, I mean, he's a very joyful, happy person. He takes pleasure in all sorts of things. And it's really important we do. But we shouldn't chase these things or cling to these things or look to them as the main reason for doing something in the first place. Similarly, when we talk about aversion to pain, for instance, and of trying not to be averted to pain, that doesn't mean we actually seek out discomfort and pain, stuff like that. It's not the point. But again, we don't worry about that too much, and it's particularly important when it comes perhaps to criticism and things like this. Yeah, it doesn't mean we have to sort of take like and always embrace these things, but we don't let them kind of contaminate everything we do, because all these things are really looking for very, very short-term results and short-term gratification. You know, we're very much trying to work in things more for the long term. But that's the 8 worldly dharmas. It does sometimes say, you'll read this sometimes or hear it, that if any action is contaminated by these things, it's non-dharmic or non-spiritual. But we have to be very, very careful for that, because who of us can really honestly say that they don't creep in? You know, probably most things we do, one or the other of them will tend to creep in. So again, we have to be realistic about that, and we just try and be mindful to spot these things. I used the example last week of when we're doing sometimes our music therapy, which can be quite ego affirming, because people generally are very, very nice and appreciative to you, but once in a while they won't be, and that's inevitable, particularly if you do something like that with people with dementia. So you have to try not to let that get in the way and not worry about it. That's the point. Or it'll sort of dissuade you and you'd be less inclined to keep doing it. That's just one example. Now, the real crux of this verse, though, is, and I'm going to go back to verse 1 now. The best way that we can really practice purely is through really understanding, and eventually really understanding, emptiness. This is actually the antidote to clinging to this. I remember going back to week 1, I talked about this reified notion of self that we have at the core of our being, this exaggerated notion of the self as being something more independent, more fixed, more solid, more inherent than it really is. And that applies to the eye. It actually applies to all the phenomena we come into contact with. And when it talks here about through perceiving all phenomena as illusory, this is what this is really getting at. Now, what do we mean by as illusory? I think that's important. It doesn't mean that existent phenomena are complete illusions, and that's quite important. You'll often hear, particularly if you're studying emptiness, they'll talk about comparing phenomena to things like magicians, illusions, or dreams. They are illusory like, but they're not total illusions. And that is quite important, because if we go towards that, we're negating too much. You know, that's veering towards nihilism. There are things that are total illusions. These are things, I mean, some of the things we imagine in childhood, for instance, are totally illusionary. They don't really exist at all. Quite a lot of misunderstandings we probably have now might come into that category. In fact, our exaggerated notion of I is an example of that, because it doesn't actually exist at all. Yeah, and that is quite important. But when we talk here about all phenomena as illusory, they're talking about existent phenomena. So that could be, it could be Martin or Toby or Adita or Susie or Sarah. It could be this computer in front of me. It could be our cat sat here. It could be absolutely anything that we come into contact with. And the reason they're said to be illusion-like or as illusory is because there is a discrepancy between the way things appear and the way they actually exist. And this is what the teachings at emptiness are really getting at. Things that do exist as dependent arisings, that's one phrase you'll hear, or dependent originations, in dependence on a whole myriad of causes and conditions. And there are different levels of subtlety of that. I haven't got time tonight to go into this too much. But the next discovery module is actually the emptiness one, and you'll certainly be looking at this more when you do that. Things do exist, and as I say, there are different levels of subtlety when it comes to the causes on which they're dependent. We can think in terms of the obvious side of cause and effect, so very physically, in terms of physical causes and things like that. But it goes much deeper and more subtly than that. It also includes consciousness, and the way that we actually perceive, apprehend, conceptualize and label phenomena. That is all part of this interdependent flow of cause and effect, of which we're all a part. Yeah, so that's on different levels of subtlety. When it comes to something like the I, or say Martin or Toby, say, or I could say I, or I could say you, in relation to Toby. That exists as a label which is imputed in dependence on this process of body and mind, which is actually changing all the time. Yeah, That's okay. That's not wrong. That's what I remember I said last week, I think, that there are right or wrong notions of I. So if I say I, and all it is a label imputed onto this ever-changing process, that's fine. The problem is we mix up with that an exaggerated notion of I that's more than that. That's something much more concrete, much more solid, much more inherent. Yeah. When it comes to the I, we cling to that, and that's actually at the root of self-centered attachment and aversion. Similarly, when it comes to external phenomena, which also appear to us in that way, that's actually the root of becoming too attached or averted to these things. And that's what's actually at the root of our problems, you know, from a Buddhist point of view. Now, actually realizing emptiness is actually the key to becoming liberated from suffering and progressing all the way to full enlightenment. For most of us, certainly in my case, this is a long, long way down the road. That just to give a clue, that's actually achieved by gradually refining our understanding of emptiness and selflessness. And when we talk about emptiness, well, all that means is things lack this kind of inherent solid existence that appears to us. And it's why it's expressed in negative terms, because that's the direct antidote to clinging to things as if they're more solid, more inherent than is actually the case. Yeah, but the purpose is so we can let go, stop grasping, and actually live more within this flow of cause and effect. Yeah, you know, so we're not kind of fighting against that, which we're doing at the moment. And if you combine the conceptual understanding and develop calm, abiding concentration, eventually these two come together. That's what we call single pointed concentration. That meditation we did at the start on the breath, that's one example of that kind of meditation. Yeah. Whereas the Tonglen is more what we'd call an analytical kind of meditation in a way. But you do this with emptiness, and eventually the two will come together. And you can actually directly experience, directly realize, directly perceive emptiness and selflessness. And that's the real key, as I say, to achieving liberation and eventually to full enlightenment. But for us at the moment, that is a long way off, but it is important that we still bring to bear whatever understandings we currently have of emptiness and interdependence. And try and remind ourselves of that when we're going about our life and doing things. It's a good antidote to clinging to things too much, getting too attached and too averted to things. I think that's probably enough on that because we've only got so much time tonight. The only thing I want to say just to finish that, because it kind of connects with what I said the first week, the wisdom side of the path, which is the teachings on selfless and emptiness, and the method side, which is particularly important in that is compassion. These two very much work together and they do affirm and support each other. And it is very important appreciating that, because some people are more drawn to the one or the other. Probably most of us are one way or another. It could be either way. Some people are much more drawn to the kind of emotional side and compassion side. They might perhaps think emptiness is all very, very heady and conceptual. And it can appear like that at first, but it isn't if you keep working with it. It's actually very, very practical. And the sole point of it is to stop grasping. It's important to remember that. It's not just for the sake of intellectually philosophizing, you know, about things. But these two very much affirm and support each other. Compassion, for instance, just to give one example, is very much in line with the empty and interdependent nature. Yeah. I mean, its opposite, hatred, is very much, I would suggest it's worth checking this, tends to go side to side with a very strong separation between yourself and others. Whereas when we're feeling love and compassion, it actually brings us closer and we're more in line with that interdependent nature. So that's one example. But it is important that these two, you remember the first week I compared them to two wings of a bird. It's some teachers need both. That's important. So, okay, I think that's enough on that. Because I'd like to have some good discussion tonight. If anybody's got any questions on that, because it was a bit of a crash course in emptiness, do please feel free to bring them into the discussion. And I'll be really, really happy to discuss that. But I thought I'll leave you for 10 minutes now amongst yourselves. Just chat about any of the things I've talked about, or very importantly about that Tonglen meditation. And perhaps think of ways that you can use that beneficially and apply it, whether on your moped or in other ways in your everyday life. And if you can, just talk a little bit of what I've said there about the emptiness and seeing full phenomena as illusory, and see perhaps how you Might see how that can help us just practice things a bit more purely, without grasping, without self-centered attachment and aversion. Okay, so I'll leave you for 10 minutes. We'll go next door again now, and I'll come back, and you'll know when I'm back because I'll just switch my camera straight back on. Okay. Right, the example I'm going to cite on this, I actually heard from Venerable Ajahn Sumedho, who's a Theravada practitioner and teacher, very, very impressive person to meet him. And he was talking about attachment to conceptuality. And he said they had at Amaravati an incense holder. It was a very, very beautiful painted incense holder that they'd used in the shrine for many, many years. It was an incense holder for everybody in that community. That worked. Yeah. If somebody said, can you put some incense in the incense holder, they'd know exactly what they meant. And obviously it functioned as an incense holder. One day though, somebody came to Amaravati from the country of origin of that object. I can't remember where it was in Asia. And they walked into the Gompa and just burst out laughing and said, why have you got a spittoon in front of the Buddha? Yeah. Now, to that person from that culture, that was a spittoon. Now, again, it performed the functions of a spittoon, so that's okay. Yeah. Equally, for the person at Amaravati, it performed the functions of an incense holder. That's okay. That works as well for that culture. Yeah. So you can see there, it's not actually inherently either a spittoon or an incense holder. It depends on the way it's labelled and used by the people using it. So there's a sort of, if you like, an element of subjectivity there, and a certain element of cultural consent. But that doesn't mean you could validly label it as anything at all. Because if somebody from Amaravati labelled it as a washing machine, that wouldn't work. And everybody would go, what you're talking about, that doesn't work. Can you see what I mean with that example? It both shows that things don't inherently exist from their own side. It depends on the way they're labelled. They can be labelled differently. But labelling can't be completely random. Yeah, it does take a certain amount of cultural consent. And for anybody who wants to look into this further, Lama Tsongkhapa it does actually lay down specific criteria for something to exist conventionally. And basically, for labelling to be valid, it has to be imputed in relation to an appropriate base of designation, which is the collection of parts. You know, for the eye, it's the body and mind. For this computer, it's the collection of bits. And it has to perform functions that are concordant with that label. Yeah. But it's not absolute, and it can change according to different cultures and different groups of people. Does that example help? Susie?
Yes, it does.
I can't. It's an interesting area, this, and it is worth thinking about. It is worth thinking about. And the really big thing with emptiness is catching the way that things appear wrongly to us, and that's difficult. It's really, really difficult. I mean, when if I look at this computer, and it's quite important when we get very attached or averted to things, it can be quite useful. It's not that hard intellectually to see that its existence as a computer depends on the whole aggregation of things, including all the appropriate bits assembled in the right order, so it works as a computer. Also on my mind, perceiving it in a certain way, associating it with the functions of a computer. It wouldn't necessarily appear that way to a culture that had no experience with computers, but it works, you know, and it is clearly dependent on all those causes and conditions. And I can see that I'm labelling a computer, but the moment I actually look at it, and this is something we have to check, it is still appearing to me as if it is this out there as a computer, independently of the way I'm cognising it. Catching that is really, really difficult. Yeah. And it doesn't seem that important, perhaps, with a computer, but as I say, if we start thinking about something we get very, very attached to, like it could be a pleasant sound, say, you know, you will hear a noise, go, oh, what a horrible noise. You know, and it seems like that's all coming in from the outside, you know, and that kind of thing, it can be relevant. It's very, very important when it comes to the eye as well. And it's why it's good. And it's one thing, we're going to talk about this more next week, actually, as well. But when checking, when times when our eye is very, very strong. Now, it could be if you're feeling scared, that can be a good time, though it can be quite difficult to apply your practice then. But if you're feeling very, very proud, if somebody's criticising you, particularly if you think it's unfair, these are really, really good times to catch this really strong sense of an I. And if you get that sense that it's what you think's there, it seems to be much more than just a label imputed onto this changing process of body and mind. And if you can catch that, it gives you something to really, really imply. Initially, the teachings you receive an emphasis, but eventually when you start meditating on it, and you can actually apply, there are specific reasons you can apply to negate the fact that that I isn't actually existing in this independent, inherent way in the way it's appearing. Okay, yes, Susie, yeah.
Yeah, we're about short on time now.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. Sarah was just doing the same thing as well.
Oh, bless. Yeah, I need to know what a spittoon is now. Like, I love that reference.
What's that?
What's
sorry?
a spittoon?
Oh, the spittoon?
Yeah.
It's like a tin thing that you literally spit into.
Wow.
It's a thing you sometimes see in films about the Wild West, Westerns. Yeah, ting, you know, that sort of thing. They spit into it. It's not something we use in our culture, is it? But it's designed so you don't spit on the floor, so you spit into that if you feel the need to spit. But obviously to that person, it looked like a very odd thing to have in front of the Buddha on the shrine. Oh dear, have we just lost Susie? Can everybody hear me still? Right. I'd better wrap up now anyway, because we're running out of time. Hopefully Susie will come back and have a chat with her at the end, because she's actually hosting. I'm not quite sure why we're still running. Next week, we're going to look at ways of dealing with afflictive emotions like anger. We'll particularly look at anger, but then we can also transfer that to things like jealousy and depression as well, and all sorts of things. So we're going to look at a little bit of practical Buddhist psychology. I'm going to send out in an email, I'll send the link to that retreat day, and I'll also include a little handout on ways to deal with anger. That's something that I did for a class I know years ago, that when we did it at Jamyang Bath. But don't think that list is comprehensive. So when you have a look at it, you might well have other ideas yourselves with successes you've had in dealing with problems like that. And obviously you can bring those into the discussion next week. So I think that's it. We'll just do a little dedication. So as usual, try and give yourself a bit of credit for the effort you've made coming here this evening, which I'm sure has helped everybody in the group. And take joy in that, give yourself a little slap on the back. Some of the things you could have done instead. And again, let's think how any benefit that's come through all the subtle workings of cause and effect will contribute to the long-term benefit of all sentient beings. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Have a lovely
everyone.
week.
Yeah,
Sorry? What was that, Tove? I didn't hear.
just said thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Oh, pleasure. Thank you.
Martin,
See you next
I'm
week.
just wondering, the recording is still going. So are you able to?
No, because I'm not hosting. Hopefully Susie will rejoin. It'll start when we disconnect the call anyway.
Yeah.
And I'll send a little email to Susie to check she's okay. I'm sure she just got disconnected.
Thank you. Have a lovely week.
Okay, but thanks for pointing it
Bye-bye.
out. Enjoy your Vajrasattva as well, Adita. You've got that now, haven't you? And cheers, Toby. You take care. See you next time.
Bye-bye.